I want to introduce tonight's speaker, Patrick Donmoyer. Patrick is the director of the Pennsylvania German Cultural Heritage Center at Kutztown University, a folklife museum and research center on the Kutztown campus. An avid speaker of Pennsylvania Dutch and advocate for regional folk culture, Patrick's work blends language, cultural traditions, and vernacular architecture in his folklife research. Patrick is the author of numerous articles and 3 books: Hex Signs, Myth and Meaning in the Pennsylvania Dutch Barn Stars, Powwowing in Pennsylvania, Braucherei, and the Ritual of Everyday Life, and most recently, Painter of the Stars, the life and work of Milton J. Hill. He is also the past president of the Historic Barn and Farm Foundation of Pennsylvania. So please welcome our speaker, Patrick Donmoyer.
All righty, thank you, Michael, and thank you everyone for joining us this evening. Tonight we will be exploring one of the most celebrated of all aspects of Pennsylvania agricultural traditions. That is the Pennsylvania barn. This is a particular architectural form that developed here in Pennsylvania and spread all throughout North America. I'm going to do a screen share real quick just to make sure we can all see the beginning of my slides. Someone let me know if you can see it all right. Michael, is that okay?
Yes, Patrick, that's coming in just fine.
Perfect, thank you. All righty. So this evening, we're going to be exploring the Pennsylvania barn. We're going to be looking at many different details of the barn and overall use of the barn so that you get a better idea of how this barn developed over time, how it was used throughout the generations, and its cultural significance. I want to stress a number of different aspects about the barn, but one of the most important things I want to share with you this evening is thinking about the Pennsylvania barn in relation to its context. Even though we're going to be seeing a lot of photographs of the barn from my research, doing field work throughout a number of counties in Southeastern and also Central Pennsylvania, a little bit also in Western PA, the truth of the matter is that many of these shots of the barn tend to include everything else that's all around the barn on the farm. And I want to make sure that we all recognize that the barn is just one part of a functioning farmstead. This particular view that you see here was taken by Dr. Don Yoder in the 1960s. It's one of the farms that's near and dear to my heart in Berks County. And you can see many classic aspects of this particular Libby farmstead just outside of Virginville. You not only see this large Pennsylvania barn with stars across the front of it, you can see a pig house that's to the left of the barn. You see a milk house in the front, a nice farmhouse where you can actually see porches and also a basement level kitchen. You see chicken houses, wood sheds, all kinds of different aspects. We have to recognize that the barn is just one part of this overall farm complex, which also relates as well to the land. You see meadows, you see agricultural fields, you see woodlots, you see the gently sloping landscape that actually gives rise to the second story of the barn as well. All of these things are interrelated, and we have to consider this context. The barn is important. The barn also has many features, but it is greater than the sum of its parts. I also want to point out that we have many different modernized farms that are still in operation. The previous one I showed you had a historical flair to it. This particular modern dairy that you can see in Lebanon County also again shows the way in which the barn continues to be a focal point in the landscape, even as the landscape continues to change, showing the way in which the barn continues to be an important aspect, not only of our history, but also of contemporary farming practices here in Pennsylvania. Now, when I began the process of documenting barns, I was looking for certain things in particular. I was looking for the decorative designs on the front of the barns, known today as barn stars or hex signs. I'll be showing you a couple examples of those this evening, but I'm really going to be focusing on the broader dimension of the barn. As I mentioned before, when I first started doing this research, I was focusing on the stars themselves and oftentimes had my blinders on about the significance of the rest of the landscape. And gradually this awareness dawned on me. After about maybe 6 months of doing this photography, I started noticing that too many of my photographs did not include the broader context. So while I was, of course, documenting the icing on the cake, the proverbial icing here being the barn stars on the barns, one of the ways in which we've celebrated the barns in Berks County and Lehigh county, we also have to recognize that the barn has a greater significance beyond its decoration. And these are important focal points on the barn, and they're part of what makes the barn also a focal point in the landscape. But we also have to remember the way in which all the parts of the barn help to communicate relationships, and these relationships are bigger than any one part. We have to remember the way in which the stone was locally sourced. The lime that was used to create the mortar in the stones, that was all sourced locally as well. The iron many times hadn't been taken too far. It was coming from local furnaces. In the Ole Valley, you find terracotta tiles as well, used on some barns and other outbuildings, as well as the wood. All of these things express a relationship with the land. So these barns are not just plunked down in our landscape. They are part of the landscape, and they're helping to articulate the way in which human communities are interacting with and very dependent upon the landscape that is yielding this robust agricultural tradition here in Pennsylvania. And we also have to remember as well that these barns are emblems of community cooperation, the way in which neighbors, friends, family would get together and help one another through mutual assistance to raise their barns, to replace them as well in times of catastrophe, such as fires or storms. And so they are emblems, not just of the agricultural traditions, but of the communities themselves that have perpetuated these traditions, and are oftentimes showing some unique attributes related to those regional communities themselves and how those communities continue to express their local culture. Now, this evening, I want to talk about the Pennsylvania barn, not merely as a blanket term for all barns in Pennsylvania, but more specifically about those barns that possess two very distinctive features that identify them as an architectural type, known as the Pennsylvania barn. This does not apply to all barns in Pennsylvania. These are the barns that possess a forebay overhang in the front of the barn that shields the stable wall from the elements, as well as banked access, allowing a wagon to drive up either a natural ramp or a constructed ramp into the second floor. So you actually have direct access with a wagon and horses originally. These two features are what create the classic Pennsylvania barns, but there are many different forms of Pennsylvania barns. And there are also barns that preceded these in the landscape that are important for us to be able to understand the role of the Pennsylvania barn and its relationship to other architectural types within our local communities. The earliest barns that we have in Pennsylvania, I'm going to touch base on rather quickly because these are some forerunners. They're interesting. They give us a little bit of information about some of the techniques that would be used across all different forms of barns. And yet some of these are so very specific that I don't want to get too deep into them. I'd rather focus on the Pennsylvania barn, but I do want to mention a couple of these other types as well. Ground barns are one of the more common early types that you find, especially in southeastern Pennsylvania, that consist of a single level barn with lofts above the stables that usually flank a central drive-through. So oftentimes you have a barn just like this reconstruction of a log barn that you see at Landis Valley. The vast majority of these are things that are actually decrepit today or completely covered in siding. You would never recognize that they're log. This particular shot is very important because it helps us to be able to see the way in which this log ground barn is actually two separate log cribs joined by a roof that you can drive a wagon right through the lintel. And this is an important thing because you're going to see many different ways in which this particular double crib system also was later employed in some of the earliest forms of the Pennsylvania barn. But this allowed for a horse stable, a cattle stable for cows, as well as an area to bring your wagon in to offload hay into lofts above. Those lofts were typically accessed through portholes cut through the logs. So these hay holes on either side would allow you to take the loose hay, forkful by forkful. Of course, baling wasn't yet a technology in the 18th century when these barns were being built. So what you're seeing is forkful by forkful hay was brought up into the upper level for storage. And the logs also provided additional ventilation to make sure that that hay could properly dry. Any threshing or grain processing was done right in the center of that drive-through, and you could also park your wagon in there and close the doors on either side to keep your wagon out of the weather. So this is a really important form, and it took many different permutations. You'll see some of them have stone on the bottom and log above, and you'll see many different forms of this particular type of ground barn. You'll also see some that are purely frame or frame on top of stone. And this is an important thing to see. Now, you'll also find, too, that some ground bars, especially in central PA, Adams County in particular is a hot spot for this, and then also a little bit in the bottom of Cumberland County and some other areas right around that vicinity, you'll see some ground barns that have some unusual features. They have a forebay. Now, I mentioned before that this is one of the diagnostic features of a Pennsylvania barn, and that is when you have an overhang on the front of the barn. Now, this has an overhang that shields that front stable wall, but it's still not banked into the earth. So this is not a true Pennsylvania barn, but it is one of those forerunners that you can see. You actually access the second story instead by means of a staircase that actually comes in the front of this barn in Dillsburg. And you can see a little bit more of a detail there of what this looks like underneath that forebay, where the joists for the second floor are actually cantilevered on top of the sill here. And that means that they're anchored in the back of the structure so that it provides just enough weight in the back so that that whole unsupported front can just hang on the front of the building and be perfectly secure. You'll also see other examples, smaller overhangs on ground barns throughout Adams County. This is an important thing to be aware of, that this is a feature that is identified as being a Germanic feature, something that was brought and introduced by Pennsylvania German families within the region. And yet it took a little while in some cases for these barns to take on the forms that we would later see as classic Pennsylvania barns. And I'll say that these barns were also being built concurrently with what we would recognize today as full-fledged Pennsylvania barns. Here's another example of a ground barn, stone ground barn. Again, you can see the way in which this also has a very similar layout to those log crib barns, but on a larger scale. It's got hay lofts on either side of a central drive-through. There's a little bit of a slope to the landscape, and you can see the stables are offset, a stable on either side. This was built by a Hessian mercenary by the name of Caspar Mull, who after the Revolution settled in the Ole Valley and built this barn in the 1770s. It was originally covered in red terracotta tile. There are also bank barns throughout southeastern Pennsylvania that are not true Pennsylvania barns as well. These are also forerunners and an influence ultimately to what we think of as the Pennsylvania barn today. These are English bank barns. They don't have a forebay, but instead they have this overhanging pent roof. The detail of the pent roof here you can see. These are individual beams that are inset in the wall. In the front wall, there's also a flashing line, typically of stone, that helps this little roof to be able to set right on the front of the structure and to overhang those front stable walls, providing the same shelter, but without the upper story space that characterizes a forebay, as we will also see later. Now, the other thing that's interesting about some of these English barns is that at one point in time, you'll find that many of these barns that were mostly late 18th century, some early 19th century, often got converted into Pennsylvania barns. For instance, you can see this English bank barn in Mizzellum Springs. You can see if you look around the front, the pent roof is no longer there. That's because it was taken off at one point in time in order to accommodate a forebay. And so this forebay you can see here on the right side, it was actually put up on stone piers on either end as well. This English barn was modified to look like the barns that would have typified the Pennsylvania Dutch cultural region. And this is an interesting thing because there is often an interplay between these types of barns. Sometimes you'll find properties that have more than one type of barn on them as well, some English in influence, some Pennsylvania Dutch in influence. Now, when we talk about the true Pennsylvania barn, I foreshadowed it a little bit with the last photo. That overhang that you saw, and I'm going to go back for just a second, you can see the way in which it made that roof line characteristically asymmetrical, hanging longer in the front than it does in the back, if you look very careful. Now, this is foreshadowing a particular type of barn that is one of the earliest manifestations of the Pennsylvania barn. It is the Schweitzer Barn. The Schweitzer Barn gets its name from the Pennsylvania Dutch word for Swiss. And so Schweitzer is the word for Swiss, and it was used because the origins of this particular style of barn do come from Switzerland. And this is something that has been proven by recent research that we can find many precedents of these barns directly in the areas from which many people emigrated to Pennsylvania from those areas. And if you take a look at this particular barn, you can see it has those two classic features. You can see the overhang in the front. You can see that there's a little bit of a sloped landscape to the back that is banked into the second floor. But again, this characteristic asymmetrical roof line highlights the fact that this forebay is a frame structure on the front of otherwise, in this case, a stone barn. Many times when you find Schweitzer barns, whether they are stone or frame or log, you're going to find that that front forebay oftentimes has a very shallow, characteristically shallow bit of siding, sometimes only say 8 or 10 feet, depending on the dimensions of the barn. Whereas a lot of later standard barns that I'll be going over have 16 feet of siding on that front forebay. So this creates a very distinctive appearance. Here's a view of that banked access as well that I've mentioned. So you can drive a wagon right up onto the second floor. You also get a little bit of a good view of that gable profile. And here is a straight on gable profile that gives you the opportunity to see the way in which this particular classic form of the Schweitzer has an asymmetrical roof line. Now, as I mentioned as well, not all of these had stone ends like this particular barn in Oley. You're going to find that some of these are stone, some of them are log, and some of them are frame. But here's a good example of what this looks like on the inside of the barn. The forebay, this front extension, is an integral part of the barn, but you'll see that it's very lightly framed here in the front. You can walk from one end to the other. Only in some barns do they have these supports here, oftentimes above head level. Sometimes they're something you have to duck underneath, depending on the circumstances. But you're going to find that this particular style of barn allowed for grain to be stored in that very front section for drying purposes. At one point in time, if you look at the old farmers' almanacs, they suggest that people actually harvested their grain many times in the summertime and then waited as much as a month or more before threshing it, or threshed it gradually. Threshing was a process whereby you remove the kernels from the top of the grain. And this was an area that was used for drying that kept it separate from the rest of the barn, from the hay mows and also from the wagon bays where there was work being done as well. Here's a classic example of the log Schweitzer. Now, this particular one, as I had mentioned before, there are log crib Schweitzers that essentially have that same basic layout of the log ground barn that I showed before, put on top of a stone foundation, and then there is the forebay extension that is an integral part of the barn. That is what you would consider to be a classic log Schweitzer. This one actually has something that's a little bit unusual. It is a posted log Schweitzer, meaning that this post here serves as the anchoring point for all of the individual logs that are anchored into it, rather than having the logs meet on the corner for corner log notches, as you would typically see in a log home or other log structures. So this one's a little bit unusual in Adams County, but I thought it was a nice example to be able to show the way in which these are also log. And here is a nice log Schweitzer in Schuylkill County. You can see again that forebay on the front as well, that you can walk the entire way through that front area. It was originally used for that purpose of being able to dry grain. Now, in the midsection of the state, you're going to find that Schweitzer barns did not stay asymmetrical as you see in those classic examples I've shown you. In fact, they get built onto, and the style morphs over time substantially. It became almost as common as the classic form. You'll find ones that have these large rear stone outsheds, just like this particular barn here. If you look on the end that's opposite the forebay on the bank side, the bank actually comes up between two different bank side shed extensions, and those were often the location of the granaries. Now, for many of us in Berks County, where I'm doing most of my work, you'll find the granaries are actually in the forebay later on, but in Central PA, they're often in the back of the barn, and that's what these back outsheds are used. And you can see here that there's this door leading into that granary for loading purposes. The granary is where you'd be storing all of the grain used for animal feed. So this is such an important thing. And note as well, you see these slit ventilators all over the end here as well. Those are indicating that this barn was created before 1830. Now, here's another example of a Schweitzer, built onto many times. There's a shed on the side, there's two outsheds on the back, and then there's actually a shed entirely over the back ramp entrance as well that's made into a dormer. So underneath all of that is a Schweitzer. You would know that from going inside. You'd also know that if you looked at the forebay side of it, you'd see this very shallow front edge. But it's a really important thing to be able to note that these did not just stay in their classic forms, but they had various iterations in many different communities. Now, one of the most important forms of the Pennsylvania barn, aside from the Schweitzer, is the standard barn. And this is what many people think of when they automatically think of the Pennsylvania barn. They think of this barn where typically the entire roof line is symmetrical. Typically, I'm giving a caveat there that sometimes there are also add-ons that might change that roof profile. But many times what you find is that rather than having the forebay projecting off the front of the barn, it is actually contained within that symmetrical roof profile. So it's actually that the stable wall is set back from the front of the barn. So if you look very carefully here, you can see that it's a stone stable wall underneath the forebay, and the forebay is still up and above, but it's contained within the masonry walls. This particular style here, you can see, has stone all the way to the peak of the roof. In Berks and Lehigh, oftentimes that indicates that it's late 18th century up until, say, maybe around 1830, and shortly thereafter. Oftentimes by around 1840, you're going to see that many of these barns started having stone up to the eave level, and then later, as you can see here, are full frame above the stable level. This particular barn is an 1870s barn in the Adams County area, and you can see the way in which these standard barns, as time went on, grew larger and larger. Especially, they got extremely wide and squat in their dimensions. They are massive in central Pennsylvania, much larger, in fact, than what you're going to be typically finding in Berks and Lehigh and Lebanon. In western Lebanon, you're going to see some barns that are getting more of that very distinctive Pennsylvania, central PA feel to them, with louvers and cupolas from the late 19th century as well. Now, here's an example of the barn at the Heritage Center at Kutztown. This particular barn is a classic decorated Berks County barn, has 8-pointed stars, arches over top of all of the doors, as well as a running scalloped line along the bottom of the forebay. You can see, again, this is a classic standard barn. It has a symmetrical roof line. You'll also see that that forebay is contained within the structure rather than projecting off of the front. And you'll notice as well, if you look very carefully, you can see on the second floor, there's a double set of doors marked by 2 arches. That indicates the area where threshing was taking place, because those doors would be opened up to create a tunnel going through the barn. The back doors were open, the front doors were open, and it created a positive pressure so that as you're threshing your grain in there, you don't get a buildup of particulate matter, and you don't end up getting exposed to a lot of that. So it would carry it right out of the building. Now, as we progress in time, you start to see, especially post 1850, an increasing use of essentially a full frame barn, frame entirely above the stable level. This is not to say that frame barns did not precede that time period. It's just to say that after 1850, the vast majority of the barns you're going to find are frame. However, as early as the 1780s and 1790s, you're finding plenty of barns that are frame. The 1798 direct tax assessment in Pennsylvania lists lots of frame barns. So don't misunderstand what I'm saying. There were frame barns. It's just that they tend to characterize what you're going to find late 19th century and thereafter. And this had to do with the expense involved with wood. Believe it or not, prior to that time, building stone gables, massive stone gables, was extremely cheap. And wood siding was very expensive because it required a sawmill. After around the mid-19th century, sawmills really started becoming much more prolific with what they were able to produce, and the siding became very, very much less expensive, in fact, than stone, and that's part of what precipitated that change that you're going to see. Again, here's some central threshing doors on the front of a barn with decorations. The standard barns are really the most decorated barns that you're going to find in southeastern Pennsylvania with barn stars. It's very rare to find Schweitzers that are decorated because technically they precede the time when decoration was as firmly established. We really find that the vast majority of the barns that were decorated really began after 1800, and between 1800 and 1840 is when the earliest ones that we find are located chronologically. You'll also find for many standard barns that you'll have gambrel roofs. This is a distinctive roof profile that has a hip on either side. And so basically this creates an extra contour in the roof profile on either end. And these also allowed for greater storage space on the inside of barns. And so this is another standard barn, just with a gambrel roof style. Now, I want to go through the barn itself and talk about many of the interior features that you're going to see and how they functioned. But first, I want to do a quick sweep of the forebay outside. Typically, when folks talk about the forebay, they're, of course, talking about that space in the second floor that was used originally for drying. However, a lot of folks recognize that the forebay is also creating this really important shadowed area in front of the stables, where you have a long series of doors. All of those doors light either into stables for the animals or feed aisles that people could walk into in order to be able to access an aisle that the animals can't access. And then that's where you would also have grain bins and be able to toss the grain in to the animals into their troughs. So each of those doors is specialized. You'll find on the end closest to the house, typically the horses are located, and on the far side is typically the cows. Underneath, you can see all of the exposed beams of the joists. These are cantilevered in this particular case. They are anchored into the back of the structure. They rest on the top of that forebay wall, and then the forebay itself, or I should say the stable wall, and the forebay itself is freestanding, usually without any additional support, except for in many cases for standard barns, there is a support on either end, known as the pilar, and oftentimes there's a return on that pilar as well. So here's an example of that return on the pilar called a pilar eck in Pennsylvania Dutch. Eck means corner. Pilar is another word for essentially a pier or a pillar. So they're referring to those strong portions in the front of the barn that are really going to serve as the important structural support of the barn on that front end. But that little kick or return that you see there, it makes an L shape. It's referred to as a pilar eck in that little corner. And oftentimes you'll find in Northampton County and parts of Lehigh, there are closets in there where you can very conveniently store horse harnesses and things like that. An important aspect of the barn and a very important regionalism. This isn't found in all parts of Pennsylvania. It's found especially in Northampton and Lehigh, but also in some other areas as well. You'll also find the front stable walls, if they are made of frame rather than stone, which is often the case, central Pennsylvania especially, folks would use that opportunity then to building cabinets, additional louvered ventilators, all kinds of things that the stone did not allow as much flexibility. So sometimes you'll find cabinets with horse veterinary medicine in them. You'll find bridles, all kinds of things stored in specialized cabinets on that front wall. Now, if we go into the barn, I want to show you a few things. First, we're going to notice that these doors are particular types of doors on the classic Pennsylvania barns. These are what people refer to as Dutch doors. They open in two sections. So the upper section swings free from the lower section so that you can ventilate for the animals. In this case, you can see a horse putting its head directly out. This is an important thing because you can ventilate while keeping the animals in. Or you can do work in there in the stables and be doing work and have that door open for ventilation and keep the animals out. So it served a dual purpose. But this is called a Dutch door. Now in central PA, you'll find this in Adams County, Cumberland County, Perry County, I'm sure in a wide variety of other locations as well. But those are the areas that I know it from. You'll find examples of where there's this half circle cutout, like a little lunate cutout, you can reach through and grab a hold of usually a wooden spring latch that would release the door from the inside. This is a distinctive regionalism. Again, you can find the ways in which these details help to define the character of these barns in different areas. Here's a comparison with what you typically find in Berks and Lehigh, Lancaster and Lebanon. You'll find a lot of these very distinctive latches that have almost like a bird head on them and a little bit of a flip tail. They're often anchored with two staples, and they go into a staple on the opposite side of the door jamb so that you can slide it over and keep the door shut. And then they're often set, rather than being flat, completely horizontal, they're set at a bit of an angle towards the door jamb so that gravity will help to keep them shut. That way, if you have a pesky horse who likes to pound on the door with its muzzle or its hoof, it's not going to eventually knock that latch out because gravity will help keep it in place. Now, you also have another feature that's very distinctive in southeastern Pennsylvania and central Pennsylvania. I'm interested in finding out about where else this may have gone in North America. This is the Spriggle, and this is a structure that is essentially a pocket door bolt. So you can slide this piece of wood out of a pocket in the door jamb across to the other side, and you can then fully ventilate the stables. You can open those doors fully, and the animals still can't get either out or in. So if you want to keep the horses in but fully ventilate so it helps to dry, you can do that and open the full doors and slide the bolt across. This is called a Spriggle in Pennsylvania Dutch. And Spriggle literally means bar or rail. And this is an interesting thing because in some cases, folks have different ideas about how these are used. These also do appear in Chester County on some barns that may have an English influence as well as in Montgomery County. So this is interesting. And I'm fascinated by the fact that this is characterized by a Pennsylvania Dutch or Pennsylvania German word, and yet seems to be used within both communities. And that really is the case for the Pennsylvania barn. You're going to find that there were Pennsylvania barns built by English Quakers. You'll also find that some of those early English ground barns were also built by Pennsylvania Dutch farmers as well. So this is important to notice that the barn is a point of intersection and sharing among the different cultural groups in Pennsylvania. Now here is a double Spriggle. Presumably, depending on the height of the animal, if you're wanting to keep a donkey in or a large draft animal, you've got different heights there. So these spriggles allowed you to adjust for the animal, which is pretty interesting to me, because if it's, of course, for a tall draft animal and you put it across, you might have an animal that's also short enough to get out from under it. So this is an interesting thing, and I've seen examples of these in Montgomery County, Lehigh County, and a couple other places as well. Now, the other thing you're going to see inside of the horse stables, and this is one of the easiest ways if you go into a historic barn and you don't know where the horse stables are located, you can tell by the presence of the Spriggle. That is always found on the horse side. But if you don't have a Spriggle, you can also tell by these little boxes that are in the wall, and they take many different forms. Some of them are simply stone niches, others are fully framed out with wood, and some have a little half circle cut out so you can put something in there, and it's a little harder for animals to get to it. Especially horses, which will chew on anything. These are for curry combs and grooming combs, so that you can rub your horses down after they work, clean them off. This is essential for horse hygiene, and these are essentially one of the ways that you can identify the presence of the horse stables. Again, normally that's on the side of the barn closest to the farmhouse, but that varies depending on the circumstances. But these are classic features within the horse stables. You'll also find these staked mangers in many barns that have some original stabling left. Not all barns do. Many barns were modernized after tractors were introduced, after sanitation laws in the 1940s were introduced for dairies. Many lower levels of the barns were completely renovated, poured concrete slabs, cattle stanchions made out of metal put in, and all of the original stabling was ripped out. So this is kind of rare to find, but there are more out there than you might think. But these are mangers that are used specifically for putting your hay up above. Horses can feed higher up. You'll find some of these as well in the cow stables that are lower for the cows, and there's also a trough for grain at the bottom as well. Now, you'll also occasionally find evidence of the fact that there were floors in some stables for horses. This is one of the few that I've been able to identify in Northampton County. There's a barn that has remnants of a log floor. Presumably, this was allowing then moisture to get down between the logs so that it kept the surface for the horse's feet drier. We don't completely know or understand this because I only know of one example that I've been able to examine, but this is an old feature that presumably was found elsewhere, not just this barn. But I'd love to learn more about that as well. The other thing you're going to find if you go in some front doors of barns is, in addition to the stables, there are aisles in between the stables where a human can walk in. This is actually facing the door on the way out. You can see that you can have access to putting the hay on either side for the horses up in the high mangers. As well as, in this case, you can put grain in the troughs down below, and there are grain boxes on either side as well. So this is a really ingenious system. You can walk in there. The animals can't get access to that stuff unless you give it to them. And oftentimes there's a hay drop there as well. So you can drop hay from the upper level down into that footer gong, as they call it in Pennsylvania Dutch, or literally the feed aisle, the feed pathway. And so you'll go down and be able to put that hay directly down into the animals' mangers then as well. Now, there's also mangers for cows, as I mentioned as well, that are often lower. You can identify also the fact that the stabling configurations were totally different for cows, usually a larger area for a herd of dairy cows. Oftentimes they would be feeding together in larger numbers. I will say, however, it's important to note that in the past, when people used horses as draft animals, they also fed their horses together as a group, as a team, because they were expected to work as a team. They ate as a team, and they were cooperative animals. So you'll find today that many equestrian barns will separate the horses for the most part into their own separate areas, their own stalls with their own feeding regimens. In the past, your teams of horses fed together. And I'll also mention too, another part usually opposite the horse stables on the far end is what they would refer to as a milking parlor. And this is an area that has undergone many changes over the years as sanitation laws have changed for dairy businesses. But typically what you're going to find here are individual wooden stalls with troughs, and oftentimes a hole in the edge of the trough where you could collar your cow there while milking. So they would feed while you're doing your milking. You can see a milking stool right here. And this particular barn had a dirt floor, as you can see, but the drain on the far left is a drain that allowed for the manure to very easily go into that drain and to be taken directly out of the barn. And those drains were something that was required in the 1940s for sanitation laws. So you see, this is an example of a milking parlor, and this would have been in keeping with the law at that time, although the whitewash has since been removed. Everything would have had to have been whitewashed as well due to the Department of Ag's regulations at that time. Now, another thing you'll occasionally find in the lower levels, sometimes this is accessed through the cow stables in the back, or through a feed aisle, or in the back of the horse stables. You'll find these mysterious doors that seem to lead out, but they don't go out of the barn. They go into a vaulted root cellar. Now, presumably this was for livestock roots that were actually fed to cows. And I know of a barn that's about 100 feet long, no joke, about 100 feet long, and that root cellar is about 60 feet long underneath the bank. And it's an amazing structure. I was able to go in there and take a good photograph of it, but these are not all that uncommon, because many times folks knew that if you arched that area underneath the bank, it relieved the hydrostatic pressure that pushed against that barn wall. And sometimes you'll find over time, those back stable walls will blow out because of the pressure from the soil. If there's an arch structure, it actually prevents that from happening. And one of the things you can do with that is either have an arch that's big enough to store things underneath it, or turn it into a root cellar, like in this particular case. Now, I want to talk about that bank side, since we're talking about that arch as well. There are many different types of bank accesses to the second story. So we're going to go around the back of the barn now, and we're going to walk up onto that bank, and we're going to see that some of these are essentially a slope or a ramp that is a man-made ramp. This is something that's constructed by means of a retaining wall on either side, and then soil was put up there, as well as infill, stone, and other things like that, to make sure that this is really going to last. A lot of barns, however, are built into the gently sloping landscape, so you didn't have to build a ramp. Instead, you had to excavate the basement, and then the ramp was already essentially there. So that also many times determined what direction the barn was facing. A lot of barns face south-southeast, but the fact is, you also in Maxatawny Township, Berks County, where I work every day, you're going to find that there are plenty of barns that face north. So that's an interesting thing as well that you'll find, depending on the slope of the landscape. Now, here's an example of one where, again, there's that arch. This isn't really deep enough to put anything under it. You can see the bicycle there for scale on the ramp itself. You couldn't put a wagon or anything under there. I have seen some that are tall enough that you could park a wagon underneath there. And in some cases, there are double-decker barns where there's actually a much higher barn bridge, or barn ramp, as some people will call it. And that's large enough you could actually pull a loaded wagon underneath it in some cases. But that was more common further in the southeast, especially in areas where the English Quakers settled. They took the Pennsylvania barn and added an extra level on the upper level. So there's 2 levels above the stable level, and then there was a large barn bridge going up into that upper level. This is just a standard Pennsylvania barn that you're seeing here as well. And in one case, I know of a barn in Center County where the ramp goes into the forebay. This is a little bit unusual. You can take a look here and you can see this ramp going right up into the forebay. Here's the forebay overhang. The ramp is constructed of stone and earth, and there's actually a wooden ramp that extends directly from the masonry right into that barn. It's the only one we know of like this particular example, however. It's a bit of an anomaly. Now, inside the barn on the upper level, I want to show you a couple different things. So as you approach the barn from that upper level, from the main wagon doors, oftentimes you'll be able to immediately recognize that the interior is divided into bays. The interior bays are designating specific areas within the barn that have specialized use. And oftentimes these individual bays are demarcated by specific frames, and these frames are referred to as bents. And they are individual framing units that subdivide the barn. Many times for classic 3-bay barns where you have a central bay and then you'll have a bay on either side, you'll find that that central bay is a wagon bay and a threshing floor. Usually a granary is connected in one way, shape, or form to that threshing floor for being able to put the grain directly in it after you've processed your grain. And then your hay mows are on either side, so you can pull that wagon in the center and unload your hay into different areas on either end. You'll oftentimes as well find that there are little subdividing walls as well that help to hold that mow in place where the hay goes. And these are called mowstead walls. So take a look at this entrance here. You're going to also find that there are many different cases where you'll find barns that have 5 or 6 bays. And then in those cases, you may have 2 or 3 wagon bays to enter, and more than 1 threshing bay in some cases. So this is an important thing to note, that not all barns are the same, but they have certain features in common, and I'm going to describe a number of those. So here's a better example also of a closer look of what the bent looks like, those subdividing frames. In this case, this is a stone end barn, stone to the eaves level. And what you're typically going to find is that these frames were raised as independent units and then connected to the rest of the barn as the barn was raised. And they then serve as the subdivisions within the barn. This particular one, of course, those mouse-dead walls, they get taken out after baling technology gets introduced in a lot of barns. So that you can very easily get those bales in and out. And a lot of modifications took place during that time. Baling technology was introduced at first in the 1880s, became widespread, however, in the early 20th century. I also want to point out here again, these mouse-dead walls, oftentimes they have built-in ladders that go directly up the center of a lot of these bents. So it's actually part and integral to the bent to have a ladder that you'd be able to climb up into the areas where the hay is stored as access to those hay mows. You'll also find that there are doors many times to access these different areas on the mouse-dead walls themselves. The threshing floor itself oftentimes are interlocked planks. These are planks that have a groove on each side and a spline in between them, and they are forced together very tight when the barn is built so that the grain does not spill down between the planks of the floor when you're doing threshing, because the threshing of the grain was done directly on the floor. This is where you take the sheaves of wheat or rye or barley or whatever you're going to be threshing, and you lay it directly onto the floor and you strike it with hand flails. These are a handle with a swivel top flail bar at the top that would then be struck onto the grain directly. And a lot of these floors have seen a lot of wear over time, not only from threshing, but also then from the wagon wheels as well. So a lot of these floors have a lot of character, but you can see this floor is still tight enough that it's not going to be able to allow anything through. Now, another thing you'll see from this vantage point as well is that a lot of the timbers on bents subdividing the rooms of the barn, subdividing the bays, you're going to see that they have Roman numerals, and those Roman numerals often match at points of joinery within the bents. This is because each of these Roman numerals is important. It's specific to the joint and oftentimes to the bent itself. You'll find many different systems of how this is done with Roman numerals or sometimes with hatches with little flags on them. And this gives you the opportunity to be able to see how these bents were put together based upon a plan and how each joint was many times cut to fit. And it was a very specific joint. And so members went together by means of these Roman numerals, and then of course they were pegged together. Of course, these bents as well, if you get a chance to see what this looks like filled with hay, you can see just how overwhelming this is when you're stacking this full of bales. This is a pretty big load on this particular barn. You can see how crucial those ladders are at this point in time. You would climb all the way up, and then the last part is a little tricky for some people. Getting over that top beam up there is a little bit of a step, but you can see the way in which this is stacked all the way to the ceiling. And originally, when the hay was stacked in there loose, it also would be stacked up there that high, and that's part of why these ladders are there, for access to that upper area. And of course, where the ladder meets the mouse-dead wall, there are usually holes, either oblong, bean-shaped, square, or rectangular, that are cut out so you have little footholds to get up, but it still maintains that mouse-dead wall there as well to help hold back the hay. And of course, some of these barns, you'll find hay ladders going all the way up to the peak of the roof, really bespeaking the idea that this was a lot of loose hay that was put in here all the way up to the peak of the roof. And this is an important thing to note. Not all barns have this. And in some barns as well, if you look up at that peak of the roof, just underneath the ridge, you're going to see a hay track. These hay tracks were very common 19th century technology, especially late 19th and early 20th century. People were still using these extensively in the 20th century throughout. And this is an opportunity where you'll see that there's a track along the underside of the ridge of the roof. There are systems of pulleys that allow for a large claw or grapple to go down. It will pick up hay loose, and then by means of the pulleys can be pulled up and then dragged along that track. Usually people were operating ropes for releases for the hay track, but the animals, usually a horse, or in some cases later on another piece of equipment, would be used to actually pull on the rope that would actually operate the pulley to hoist everything up and then drag it down the track in the direction of the mows, and it would drop it into each end of the barn. So this was the way that the mows were loaded. The Mousestead walls are also one of the locations where you find a tremendous amount of graffiti on early barns as well. Some of these are consisting of dates and names, sometimes barn stars, other decorative features as well. This particular barn in the Ole Valley has 14 different stars in the Sittler barn. You'll also find on the inside of these barns as well, it's a good opportunity to be able to look up at that upper gable apex and see if there is a cutout ventilator. In Pennsylvania Dutch, these ventilators are referred to as Schwalmelecher. That means swallow holes, plural. Schwalmeloch is singular, and these particular openings were often large enough to admit a swallow into the upper story of the barn. It was believed that they were good luck. Swallows will not typically nest in the upper story. They'll typically nest in the lower story, but the upper story is where you really don't want a lot of insects. And so the belief was that these swallows would go in, that they were coming every year. They would migrate, so they would leave and they would return. For many people, this was considered to be a blessing to the barn. And you see a lot of different types of designs being used as cutouts to admit the birds into the barns. Some are moons or stars or crosses, flowers, and they range in size and shape, but usually they're large enough to admit a swallow into the barn. In New England, they're called martin holes, and martin is actually another type of swallow. It's in the swallow family. Now, these ventilators are often in concert with a lot of different types of decorative features that you're going to find on the barns. And each area has its own unique and very distinctive regionalisms, whether we're talking about brick end barns with distinctive brick ventilators where the voids in the bricks are creating designs, whether we're talking about loopholes that are outlined in bricks, decorative wooden ventilators, or barn murals, or barn stars or hex signs. Each area tends to have their own decorations as well. Now, I want to take us into one last part of the barn as well. It's kind of the heart and soul of the barn in many respects, along with that threshing floor. It's kind of an extension of the threshing floor in the sense that this is where you're going to store all of that threshed grain. It's some of the most valuable product you're going to have on your barn. It's for feeding the animals, and there are individual grain bins in there, oftentimes with little tracks that you can slide boards in and then pull the boards out. It allowed you to put as much grain as you wanted to in there up to a certain level, and as you use the grain and worked your way down, you would pull the board out and be able to continue to access the front of that grain bin. It allowed that front to be somewhat modular and adjustable based on the amount of grain that you have. The back of the granary door is an area to always look for signatures. Sometimes you'll find barn builders, you'll find farm workers. This particular one has signatures in both Latin and German script. Up here it says Peter Braucher. You'll see Jacob Zell. This is all from 1851. Joseph Rabinold. This is in Greenwich Township, Berks County. And you see that there's a box lock on this particular door because this is one of the few areas on the farm that would have a lock aside from the front door of the house. And here's again a shot of those granary bins. You can see that there are boards put in there to help hold back the grain. And those are the slats that would go in there. The granary walls oftentimes double as a ledger. So if you would closely examine them, you're going to find names and dates, quantities of grain that are being sold or being apportioned. Sometimes people will be counting the number of bushels that they get from one year to the next. And this is all very important. It gives the opportunity to have a veritable ledger directly on the wall. And you can get a good idea of what's going on in that barn based on a close assessment of what goes on that granary wall. And granary walls were often whitewashed, sometimes plastered, often on the masonry side where it goes up against the stone wall in a stone barn. And it provided really nice surface for writing, either on the wood or on the plaster. And again, as I mentioned, you're going to find a lot of graffiti in barns. Some of these are in granaries, some of these are on the outside wall of the granary, but you're going to find a tremendous amount of graffiti all throughout these barns, and to a greater or lesser degrees. Now, some folks believe that a lot of that interior graffiti is there to protect the barns. The reality is we don't know. Some of this graffiti, I'm going to go back for just a sec. A lot of folks had the perception that the stars on the barns were there to protect. The general consensus among Pennsylvania Dutch people is that these were just stars, that they were decorative. There may have been different beliefs associated with them over the years, but generally speaking, folks believed that they were primarily meant to be pleasing to the eye. And instead, folks recognized that it was inscriptions that were put in the barns that were thought to be protective of the barns. And these would be barn blessings, such as this one that you see here that has astrological symbols on it. It also says, help success come to my barn, horse and stock, success and good health come to all of our stock. This particular blessing was put in place when the barn was built, and when the walls were plastered, it was kept on the inside, which is really fascinating piece that then later on turned up. I found examples of these by the same hand. So there are multiple barns in 2 different counties where this was done by the very same individual. So this was probably a folk practitioner, a healer, known as either a powwow doctor or a braucher, who was creating these astrological blessings for going into barns. But you'll also see some of these are less secretive. You'll find some on the outsides of barns that are religious inscriptions. They're meant to be blessings of the barn and meant to be often inspirational to the farmer and the farm family. The one you see on the left here from 1802 says, Gott kann bauen und abbrechen, kann nehmen und kann geben und kann nehmen jedem nach es ihm gefällt. It means God can build and he can tear down, he can give and he can take to each as it pleases him. And then at the bottom it says Henry Ertz, and then it identifies him as the maurer or the stonemason who plastered this and then had this put on the outside of the barn. So you see examples of both formal and then also concealed barn blessings that are really the heart of how people thought about their barns as being protective. And this evening, I want to finish with an idea for you. So we've looked at these barns in a variety of ways. We focused on the parts, we focused on their functions, we focused on how we differentiate different types of barns from one another, how that changed over time. As we think about these barns and as we think about the passage of time, we can't help but bring up this idea of preservation. There have been times in Pennsylvania where many barns burned by human hands, arsonists. There were times when barns were falling down by neglect, and that is still happening today. And so we have to be active stewards of the barns in our communities. We have to recognize their significance. We have to care for them, and we have to recognize that they're communicating something to us in the present about the traditions of the people who settle these communities. They are part of the heart and soul of our communities. They tell us a little bit about the identity of those communities and how that identity shifts over time. It also gives us an opportunity to recognize that these are not merely monuments to the past, but these are vital parts of farms in the present and have the potential to continue to be so for the future. I know some folks will say, oh, those old barns, they're not as useful anymore. The reality is it's a really large storage container. I would say that for any farmer, you need a lot of large storage containers. Go ahead, put a pole barn up, but leave the historic barn as well, because you're going to find that it's useful in other ways. So Pennsylvania barns have stood the test of time. They have been resilient structures. These are barns that are also continuing to be made. There are carpenters in Pennsylvania still putting up Pennsylvania barns. So these are not just echoes of the past. This slide I have up here is a Latin phrase on a barn. You won't typically find that. In fact, you won't typically find a sundial on a barn. This particular sundial has a Latin phrase that says transit umbra manet opera. It means the shadow moves, but the works remain. What it's saying is that as time passes, the works of your hands are things that are going to stick around. Now, in light of the previous slide that said that things can be given or taken away, we can think about these barns as being evidence of both the ephemeral nature of life, the way in which things can vanish, things can disappear, things can go away, but also the ways in which those things can also stick around. They can inspire us, they can teach us, they can give us an opportunity to connect with our past, connect with our culture, and to continue to connect with our community in the present day. So I want to thank you all for joining me this evening on this roundabout trip through Southeastern and Central Pennsylvania. My hope is after this presentation, you'll have a greater appreciation for the Pennsylvania barn and hopefully be of interest in your own communities too, looking at your barns, appreciating them, encouraging others to appreciating them, and also encouraging folks to preserve them. So thank you very much, and I'll open up for questions.
Well, thank you very much, Patrick. You're getting a lot of kudos over on the chat area, waiting for some things to come in on the Q&A side.
I also just put up a quick commercial for a book that I wrote a number of years ago. It's actually almost 10 years old, on decorated barns. I just want to throw this out there. This is available in a number of places online. All proceeds go to support cultural programming at Kutztown University. So check this out if you're interested in learning more about some of that early field work I did. So let's take some questions in the meantime. Mike, do you want to
yeah, I'll go ahead and I'll look through here for you, Patrick,
yeah.
As I've been looking.
Great.
Good question here. And I think this is kind of, I think we could look at Southeastern Pennsylvania, the oldest barn in our area.
That's a really good question. So I know of barns that were built in the 1770s and the 1780s. There are barns around that were built in the 1760s and 1750s as well, but not in our area. You're going to find more in that latter category as you head closer to Philadelphia. But in, for instance, that English barn I showed from Mazellum Springs, I want to say that if I'm thinking correctly, that's the 1770s. I tend to have a hard time with remembering and memorizing dates. I remember things spatially, not chronologically. So you're putting me on the spot a little bit. But I will say that barn is from the 1770s. There are also some Schweitzer barns in the Ole Valley from the 1780s. So you're going to find quite a bit of these late 18th century Pennsylvania barns around, and some earlier ones as well that are also English barns.
All right, well, thank you. Another one of the barns that came to mind for me, as far as especially one that's dated, is the Isaac Long barn.
Absolutely,
With
absolutely,
1754, I believe.
exactly.
If
Now,
that lintel is original to the barn.
well, there's a lot of. I didn't mention that one, but that's a good example. That has, of course, the long inscription on it too, with the date. I am aware of that one. That one also underwent so many changes. It's kind of hard to tell what part of that barn is original. And this is the case for many barns. I also know of some lintels in Montgomery County from the 1760s. But like parts of barns also get recycled. So in this case, one of the lintels I mentioned from the 1760s is a part of a barn that was probably previously standing there and recycled. So the same could be true of the Isaac Long barn. Parts of it could be original, and parts of it were greatly altered for sure.
All right, I have a question here from Tim Allman. I know Tim. He has a barn very close to Quentin, and this is his question. We own a stone end barn with 3 corners that are cut sandstone and 1 corner limestone. No one knows why. Do you have any insight that you want to give on that one?
Sure. So here's my question. Which direction faces the road? Can you see the limestone one from the road, or is that hidden from view?
My memory is that one's hidden from view.
There you go. So this happens frequently with masonry, especially where extra cost is involved. You dress up the side that gets most easily seen. Farmers, masons, barn builders were aware of view sheds. They're aware of where a person's going to be standing when they approach a barn, when they approach a whole farm complex. They know what you will see. I'll compare this to a farmhouse I know in Adams County. The front of the farmhouse was done with Flemish bond, and one side of the house was done in Flemish bond with brick. So that's where the brick makes little cross patterns. It's more expensive because you're using more brick to produce that type of a pattern. It's done on 2 sides of the house. The rest of the house is done in common bond, which is a lot cheaper. And so you see these types of things playing out. But the one thing I also want to highlight is that you mentioned Lebanon County barns having distinctive cornerstones, often called coin stones, and they're cut out of sandstone. And it's a very distinctive regionalism for Lebanon County, some parts of northern Lancaster. You'll see it in a few other areas as well, the way in which those cornerstones are set off. But that's a very, distinctive feature, especially as you drive the corridor between Berks, northern Lancaster, head right into Lebanon County. You see a tremendous number of those where both the sandstone and the limestone are available in the same area.
Question about paint color, Patrick.
Sure.
This is a question. What is the origin of a red barn?
So there's a lot of stories about this. And what I will say is that generally what is accepted is that the cheapest form of paint that was available was iron oxide pigment-based paint. And so this was paint where you were going to be mixing your oils, you were going to be mixing your iron oxide pigments, and you could very readily produce paint very inexpensively. There's also red wash that may have in some cases been used in place of paint. It's a little bit thinner. It's really meant to more color and protect, but doesn't provide the same level of protection as the red paint. We do know that paint has been used in a variety of different communities over time. Red is common throughout parts of Europe. You'll find in Scandinavia, in Sweden, for instance, everybody paints their houses red because there were mines that specifically had red, basically a red pigment available. Pennsylvania has a ton of red pigment available as well. Now, you'll also find people who say that the red is symbolic, that it means something, that it's religious, that it's protective. I'm going to say that there's probably room for all of those stories to have a kernel of truth. But again, I'm saying a kernel, but not a whole ear of truth. So when we talk about the paint colors, many times we find that people were doing what was practical. White barns are also common. And white, of course, you'll find red wash and whitewash being the two most common things you're going to be finding on a farm. Oftentimes, paint was reserved for the interior spaces where it was really going to dress up a space. And of course, there was paint throughout the 18th century, but people were not known to widely paint their barns until the 1830s. So this is an interesting thing, that a lot of barns were bare wood up until that point in time. If they had siding on them, that siding was typically, bare wood. So this is an interesting thing. I've heard of people charcoaling barns as well, just like they did in the South, which creates a characteristically black appearance to the surface of the barn. So there's a number of different options, but red seems to be predominant. It was a practical thing. And also then you can use the white as a trim color, and using that white as a striking trim color creates a contrast, so you can find doors at night. If you go up to the bank of the barn, and you're looking for the access door to get into the barn, the human-sized door, if it's outlined in white, you can find it pretty easily. The same goes for your stable doors as well. Oftentimes those Dutch doors are red and the outline around them is white. And it just helps to offset it enough, those two colors in combination, to really help you be able to see where you're going. This is also true with outhouses. Outhouses are typically white, sometimes with trim with a contrasting color.
Thank you very much, Patrick. This actually goes back kind of to that dating question.
Yeah.
And you had spoken about that, the earliest barns, of course, would be more to the south and east, closer in towards the Philadelphia area. And Claire asked if you had ever seen the barn at Stenton in Germantown.
No, I haven't, but I would love to.
It is a neat building. That's and there are a couple of other ones that are in right around Philadelphia that do have very early dates, like you had spoken of.
Mm-hmm.
And
now, what is the date of that one in particular?
And that one I think is around 1770 as well. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
that's a
Yeah.
fairly early one.
I've driven through Germantown and also along the Germantown Pike and seen a fair number of, I've seen some stone ground barns. I've seen all kinds of things in that area. And there are, I mean, you can look at these and tell that they're from the last few decades of the 18th century. It's rare to find things far earlier than that. Houses survive, very few houses survive from that time period, but the predominance of log structures in the earliest farms in many cases, those barns were dismantled oftentimes and replaced and upgraded later on, just like houses are also replaced. So you find these barns tend to, a lot of those early barns did not survive. But yeah, thanks for the tip about that one. I'd like to go see that in Germantown.
Here we have a question, someone looking for a little bit of clarification of something you said.
Sure.
And this is Suzanne is asking about slits in stone walls of barns.
Sure.
Am I correct that you that I heard you say that those barns typically are pre-1840?
I said 1830 typically. Okay. However, there's always exceptions to the rule. And I will say that my research in that is primarily based in Berks and in Lehigh and in Lancaster. Looking at those particular features, they exist elsewhere as well. So I don't want to ever try to make a definitive statement and say that never would they occur outside of that time frame. But generally speaking, you're going to find that they occur prior to 1830. Some major changes in barn technology started to happen around that time, and a number of features seem to have dropped off after that time. I will also say, I had written an article about this for the Reading Eagle a little while ago. Those slit ventilators are not for rifles. They were not used to weaponize the barn against anybody. There's a lot of misperceptions about how these barns were, played important roles in the American Revolution, and the vast majority of those barns weren't there in the American Revolution, and they certainly were not used for rifles. So I'll just throw that out there. But and there's some practical reasons why that's not the case, but I won't go too far. I don't want to digress.
I understand that. I've heard a lot of those stories as well, and I always found it interesting that people only attack the two sides of the barn,
as opposed to the front, right?
As opposed to the front or the back. So again, we won't go there, and I think those in many ways were kids asking questions of grandparents who wanted to keep things interesting. So
exactly.
So. We have a question from Gary, and he's asking, when Pennsylvania German farms were built, were the barns built before the house?
It depends. You're going to find some barns that predate the houses, and then you'll find some houses that predate the barns. Oftentimes, what you actually find is that the house and the barn didn't keep pace with one another, and this creates a number of different permutations later on. So you'll find instances where a log house is built and a log barn is built. Then they'll upgrade the house. Then they'll upgrade the barn. Other times you'll find that a log barn and a log house are built and they upgrade the barn and then they upgrade the house. It depends on the farm family's priorities. So there are many instances where you'll find, I'm pretty sure you can look at someone like Benjamin Rush, who refers to how the houses are modest and small. He visited the Pennsylvania countryside in the 18th century and remarked about how the Pennsylvania Dutch houses were so small, but the barns were so huge. And again, this is thought to corroborate this idea that the barns were upgraded where the houses were not. And I would say there's definitely some truth to that. Certainly he was describing some very real things. But again, it depended on the circumstances. And I would find in some cases the houses actually predate the barns, and in other cases it's vice versa. It depends on how long that barn stuck around. Like I'll give an example. At the Heritage Center at Kutztown at the Sheridan Farm, we have an 1814 farmhouse and an 1855 barn. That was because there was a log barn there prior to the 1855 barn that was probably the original barn. They upgraded the house before they upgraded the barn. So you'll find that there was a log house and a log barn there at one point in time, and they chose to make a stone house instead of upgrading the barn right away. So it's an interesting thing. You'll see varying communities have different trends in this respect. And you'll also see some situations where the houses get upgraded and the barns just get new coats of siding. So you'll find plenty of examples of early barns that are still intact and still being used in early farms throughout Southeastern Pennsylvania and Central Pennsylvania.
Patrick, just to that end, do you just want to say a couple of sentences about house barns?
Oh, sure. Okay, so we know that this was a thing in Pennsylvania, although there really are no extant examples. You'll find, for instance, in New England, there are farms where the barn and the house and other outbuildings are kind of clustered in a longer structure, so you can get from one to the next very easily. This is a holdover from Europe. Essentially, you'll find this all over Germany, especially. You're going to find barns and houses right next to each other. And part of that was a sense of utility. In many German areas, you're going to find that people lived in towns and they farmed the fields outside of those towns. This comes from a medieval model where you had essentially a wall around the cities. Usually people would live within the town. They would have their house and their barn immediately next door to it, and they would then take their draft animals out. They would leave the walls of the city to go farm, and then they would come back at the end of the day with their wagon loaded or whatever else. And it was a very different form of farming. It was thought to be very impractical because you had to sometimes travel considerable distances. So part of what you see when people get to Pennsylvania is like a differentiation from this. There's an engraving, I want to say from the 1880s, from Philadelphia that shows an Adams County farm that shows a house and a barn connected, and they're both log. So we believe that early settlement patterns may have produced some variations of these classic European arrangements of houses and barns right next to one another. But I don't know of any extant examples. If anybody else knows of one, I'd love to see it. I've looked at these extensively in Swabia and also in the Pfalz in Germany. You're going to find a number of different examples of this. You'll find some, in Switzerland, for instance, the house and barn are under one roof. Oftentimes the living quarters are above the stable level. This occasionally happens in Germany as well, in the Black Forest area. But when you really start getting into the Rhine River Valley, but also southwestern Germany like Swabia, you'll find that these are oftentimes farms that are either city farms with a house and a barn. Oftentimes there's more than one house and more than one barn in a strip. So it's a house and a barn and a barn and a house, and sometimes more. And then other cases where there's a courted enclosure. So you go to it, you see a house, but then you see a wall, and the wall actually is contiguous with the barn and the house. You go into that courted enclosure, and then you see the barn, you see the barnyard, you see the manure pile, you see the house. It's all in one big gated enclosure. And that's another form that you see in the Palatinate, which is where the vast majority of immigrants coming to Pennsylvania came through the Palatinate or were from the Palatinate, because it was right along that main artery to get out of Europe, which was the Rhine River, which you could follow all the way from southwestern Germany up through, go to Holland and leave by port cities in Holland and come to Pennsylvania.
All right, Patrick. Here's a question from Betty. Is there a list of professional barn builders, or were they mostly amateur builders?
Oh, good. You're not asking me for a list of present day barn builders to help you fix your barn.
No, we're looking at historically. And really, I think the question was, are these amateur builders or are these professionals?
I want to say professionals. And part of the reason that you're going to find this is there were professionals who then oversaw teams. Of course, this is a holdover from Germany, where you had essentially master builders and journeymen and things like that. There was not a formal guild system here in the United States that dictated these things by rules, but instead what you were typically going to find was that there were specialist timber framers. The types of work that go into the building of a barn required years of experience and expertise. These are not things that an average farmer was going to just be able to do on their own. You'll find that some farmers could probably build, I even hesitate to say it, but some folks, you look at log buildings, some log buildings could potentially have been built directly by the owner. But in most cases, there were carpenters who were actually supervising the building of these barns and houses. Even the hewing was likely done by professionals, or at the very least journeymen, people who had some level of experience. You can find, for instance, there are stories, of course, that the timber framer might even come out the year before the barn is built, mark the trees on the farm that are to be girded. They would cut around the bottom of them so that the trees would die in place, and then they would be felled. It would allow the trees would take a full year to dry out anyway. So you would fell the trees typically in the wintertime, drag them out with horses when you can drag them on the snow, and those would get counted up, put in place, and get ready for when the weather would break and the barn builder would come, be able to start marking things in order to get that frame, make sure you had enough to make that frame. And this is a process that happened over time. They discuss this in Alfred Shoemaker's The Pennsylvania Barn book, which is really the first work that was done specifically identifying the unique forms of Pennsylvania barns and the traditions that went into building them. And they highlight several different barn raisings that involve professionals. Almost always there were professional portions of the operation, but then when the raising was happening, that was all hands on deck. That was professionals supervising it, as well as you're going to find friends and neighbors would come in to help. But yes, it was done by barn builders. And these were people also who would have built things other than barns. They would have been building houses and outbuildings, and probably having other tasks on top of that as well.
All right. This is something I know you know more than just a little bit about. What is the origin derivation of the name word hex for hex signs?
Okay, sure. So I have a whole other presentation specifically on this. So I don't want to get too far, but really what we find is historically, and I'm going to actually answer this question in a roundabout way. Historically, the earliest known terms that we know of that are in the original language to describe these stars on the barns was Stana and Blume in the dialect. So in Pennsylvania Dutch vernacular language, they were referring to these as stars and flowers, Stana and Blume. Now, come 1924, there was a travel writer by the name of Wallace Nutting. He was a retired congregational minister who was also an amateur photographer and a, what shall I say, an armchair scholar who engaged in architectural hypothesizing. So he did a lot of work looking at these early architectural forms. He was very much swept up by the colonial revival in many respects. He has a house in Framingham, Massachusetts, that shows marks of his kind of inventive and imaginative approach to architecture. He visited Pennsylvania in order to create a book called Pennsylvania Beautiful. This particular book was the very first time that anybody used the word hex to describe the markings on the barns. And he claimed that these unusual markings on the barns were put there specifically to guard from witchcraft. And he claimed they were called hexafus, and that the word hexafus meant witch foot. He even went as far as to show drawings of barns that he called witchfoot barns. Well, within about 2 decades, that term hexafous had turned into hex marks and later into hex signs. And this is purely an early 20th century development. This was something that appeared nowhere in print prior to that time. Prior to that time, people did ask, what are the significance of these designs on the barns? But they always said, what are the significance of the moons and the stars on the barns? Because you would find these oftentimes celestial markings. The word hex in Pennsylvania Dutch does mean witch. So this has led some people to feel as though maybe there's something wrong with this tradition. Maybe it's something superstitious or some form of folk belief that maybe is out of fashion or maybe not preferable depending on your religious orientation. This has led to a lot of mix-up. And the reality is, when you go to places like Berks and Lehigh County, where people still speak the old language, Pennsylvania Dutch, they will tell you that the word hex sign is not an original term that was used in these communities. For instance, I just worked with the grandson of the preeminent barn star painter in Berks County in the 20th century. His name was Milton Hill. He started painting in 1902. He was a third generation painter. He started painting at the age of 14 with his father. And his father and his grandfather before him were barn painters. They had never heard of the term hex sign. He heard of the term hex sign only by the 40s. So this is an interesting situation where you can find a person born and bred in the region, operating under the tradition of more than 2 generations, 3 generations. And this person was completely unaware of what these thinkers from outside of the region were superimposing on Pennsylvania Dutch designs on the barns. I think my screen is still shared, perhaps. You can see the book, Hex Signs, Myth and Meaning in Pennsylvania Dutch Barn Stars. The book is called Hex Signs because that's what almost everybody calls them. In Berks and Lehigh, you'll still find people calling them barn stars. So I've really tried to assert and help people, to remind people of these early dialect terms as a way to help add a level of depth to our understanding of why these were put on the barns, what they say about the culture. And ultimately, these are celestial designs. They are stars, and they are part of a broader interest in the arts of depicting the cosmos and the earth. Natural forces were incredibly important to farmers and reflected their beliefs in an ordered cosmos. So all of this is part of that. But again, that's a whole other presentation. So maybe you'll have to have me back about that, Mike, at some point in time, and I could tell the rest of the story.
That sounds great, Patrick. Like I said, I knew that was something solidly in your wheelhouse, but not a 2-minute answer.
No, I think I maybe got it in there in about 3, though.
You did a great job. I was very impressed by that. So we have a question here from Linda, and she's asking, any idea why Wisconsin German barns are so different from the Pennsylvania ones? The roof lines seem different. Is it later settlement or more Scandinavian influence, or perhaps something else?
I would say all of the above. You will find that in Wisconsin there are Pennsylvania barns, depending on where you go in Wisconsin. So they did make it there. And the Pennsylvania barn is found not only in Pennsylvania, but throughout the Shenandoah Valley, throughout the Ozarks. You'll find it in the Midwest. You'll find it in the Great Lakes regions. You're going to find it even in the West Coast. So the Pennsylvania barn did go everywhere. But a lot of the Wisconsin dairy barns are something that, frankly, they're a little bit out of my wheelhouse. I don't want to talk too much about Wisconsin, but I will say that the interesting thing to me is that what you find if you go to most parts of Germany is that the barns do not look like what they look like here in Pennsylvania. Our Swiss barns, our Schweitzer barns, as people referred to those earliest forms of the Pennsylvania barns, are an indication that the people in Pennsylvania were aware that there were Swiss origins. And the Swiss are a very significant portion of the Pennsylvania Dutch population. Some people go as far as to say that they were a third of the Pennsylvania Dutch population. I don't know that statistically, but some people would say, oh yes, the 1/3 Palatine, 1/3 Swabian, 1/3 Swiss. I think that maybe is thinking in terms of cultural influence rather than true population. But there was a significant amount of Swiss influence, especially among the Amish and the Mennonites. The Anabaptist portions of the community definitely have Swiss origins. And you're also going to find some of the earliest examples of the Schweitzer Barn in Lancaster County and other areas that were settled by Anabaptists. So there is a direct Swiss correspondence there. And the venerated barn scholar Bob Ensminger, who just passed away in 2020, he visited Switzerland to many different parts of Switzerland, different cantons, which are like states within Switzerland, to determine what areas of Switzerland corresponded to the immigration of Pennsylvania Dutch people, but then also, I should say, the ancestor of the Pennsylvania Dutch, but then also what areas you're going to find barns that have forebays and are banked. And what he found was there are significant parts, multiple parts of Switzerland where those barns are found. I've been able to find evidence of one forebay barn in the area of Baden in Germany, but that is a complete anomaly. It's a 19th century barn. It's after the time of immigration too. So it also could have been influenced by some of that Swiss influence, because many people from Switzerland left and went into the Palatinate and then spread out throughout the rest of Germany. And some of those also, of course, came to Pennsylvania.
All right, Patrick, we're getting towards the end, but we still do have a few more questions. Great question here from Carol. Are there stories of old barns that collapsed due to overloading of the hay mows?
So I'm sure it happened. I also know of some examples that probably should have collapsed and haven't, especially with the introduction of large round bales. I've seen barns in central Pennsylvania that are just loaded to the gills with these round bales, and I've heard some statistics of just how much weight is in those barns. Some of that's a little frightening because those barns were not built with that technology in mind. Even when you find late 19th century barns, even ones in the 1880s when baling technology was available, it doesn't mean that everybody had it and everybody used it. So I would say probably fewer than we would think collapsed, but certainly there were probably ones that collapsed. More of a danger, however, was when people were stacking hay in their barns and it wasn't fully dry. So, the pressures that farmers have in especially the time of year when you cut your hay, there's a first cutting and a second cutting. A lot of times the first cutting is June, or depending on circumstances, late May, and then you have a second cutting in summer. Depending on the time of year, when you're cutting, and what the weather conditions are, you may find that there is substantially more moisture content to that hay. If it goes into the hay mow, it's going to cure. When it goes into the hay mow and starts to cure, it actually starts to ferment and releases heat. It can spontaneously combust. And this happened just a couple years ago in Berks. There was a big write-up about a stone barn, I believe in Exeter Township, that burned down. This was just shortly after I had written an article about those loopholes that I had mentioned, the splayed slit ventilators on the ends of the barns, and how those were there to help ventilate the gable ends of the barns where the mows were located. The mows were almost always located on either end of the barn in order to make sure that those mows had full ventilation on the inside, no enclosure on the inside. They were open, but then also on those gable walls, whether they're made out of stone or frame, oftentimes ventilators were cut into those to allow for those barns to be able to make sure that there was enough airflow to keep those barns from spontaneously combusting. But the surest way was to make sure that your hay was not wet, that it was sufficiently dry when it went in. But if you ever look for old newspaper clippings of barns that burned down, many times it was due to insufficiently dried hay.
Yeah, I know the other thing that I've heard of as far as problems with the barns is people trying to park modern day equipment in the threshing floors. And the tractors are heavier than what you see. So every once in a while you hear someone taking it in. The tires aren't resting on the floor joist, they're just on the threshing floor. And even though that's 2 inches of oak, tractors are heavy. So I've heard them actually breaking down through the boards, and then with another tractor having to haul them out. So, some of the modern things. And then also the other thing is that the modifications of barns for some of that hay tracks, people cut out some things that shouldn't have been cut out.
Yes.
And you see some things that then have to be modified to keep the barn in check. So I've been in some buildings where you start to look around and like, well, that's been cut and that's been cut, and ooh, you could take a step back.
Absolutely. And I could have done a whole presentation just on barn modifications and how it relates to technology. You're talking about hay tracks in particular, they cut out collars. So a lot of earlier barns had collars. You'd have straight purlin posts that connect directly to your purlin plates supporting the roof structure, and many times a collar going in between them. You cut that out, that's going to potentially cause some problems, and it would be a nice area to be able to pass a hay track directly through there. But over time, I've seen all kinds of barns get butchered. And then, of course, they have to put tie rods in and other things to help keep everything together, because those rods are not only helping to support the roof, but also helping to make sure that the walls and everything else is working in tandem to stay together. And yeah, I've seen a lot of modifications. I've also considering not so much a collapse story, but I've seen numerous examples of, and I've actually just passed this on roads. People who couldn't stop their tractor in time while bringing a loaded hay wagon in, and the front of the tractor busts through the front wall of the barn. Not a lot. It had enough force to stop the front, but just enough that that front end sticks out, or busts some of the siding, and you can see the front end of a John Deere sticking out. So that's an interesting one for you.
All right, I think I just have one more, and this one might be a little difficult because it's very regional. And this is Sue, and she asks about why some barns in Lancaster County. Let me see. How and why did some barns in Lancaster County come to have pink barns? And she says that this is something that she sees in Colebrook, Lawn, Mastersonville, E-Town areas.
Okay, so one thing you're going to find, and I've seen examples of this, if I'm thinking of the same thing that you're thinking of, what actually may be the case is that those barns were red first, then they were painted white, and then as the white paint started to deteriorate, you started to see a blending of the pigments, especially if those pigments chalk. They look pink because you get the chalky paint from underneath, the chalky paint from on the top, and eventually they start to weather together. You'll also see, in some cases, it's just the red peeking through in sufficient amounts. I don't know if that's specifically what you're mentioning, but I would guess that that was the case. Then again, there are people who paint their barns yellow. There are people who paint their barns green. I've seen bright blue barns that are quite nice. I've seen all kinds of different things. So really color is very variable today. So I wouldn't put it past someone to have a mauve barn or something like that, or a maybe we'll see a chartreuse one day too, but I don't know. So and also feel free, Sue, to email me or something like that if you have any pictures of this, because if it is a truly pink barn that was painted pink to begin with, I would be interested to see that and hear about where it is. But I was going to include a barn from Mastersonville tonight, actually, and didn't. It was a brick end barn that Michael Emery told me about that I was able to photograph, that I realized today I actually have photographs of that. Even before you told me, Mike, I had a historic photograph of that one I recently turned up. But that's an interesting area with quite a diversity of barns, a lot of old Schweitzers.
Yes, yes. All right, well, I want to go ahead and thank you. I think we'll end the question. We could be here all night. This is such a great topic, and really something that is, both I know near and dear to your heart and mine as well, Patrick. We've been to presentations and tours together, tilted even a few beers to talk about some of the topics that we've handled tonight. So I really thank you for coming and for doing this. So I'll just go ahead and read my closing statement, and then we'll end the presentation. So,
all right, thank you.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us for this lecture. I especially want to thank Patrick Donmoyer for his presentation, and for Kathy Donaldson for helping to organize our virtual talk. I also want to thank the Friends of the Cornwall Iron Furnace who sponsored this program. If you or your business would like to sponsor a future lecture, please contact the site for further information. And of course, donations are gladly accepted. Please join us for our next lecture on Tuesday, September 14th. Brett Ray will do part 2 of his lecture on the transcription of the 1980-1981 Cornwall oral histories. He did a really great presentation last time, but of course we ran out of time, and there's hours and hours of tape. So if you enjoyed that program, he did a real nice mix of playing some of the tape and then talking about the people and things. It was a nice presentation. So if you're interested in that, that will also be a virtual presentation. And like I said, we'll be doing that Tuesday, September 14th, also at 7 p.m. So just a reminder that the site, the museum, is now open Friday through Sunday. Please check our website for details about tour information. Of course, the easiest thing also would be just to call the site itself, 717-272-9711. So please stay safe, everyone. Hope you enjoyed it, and good night.